Great stuff. Thanks. Listen, today we're going to talk about a topic that's probably on the top of mind for a lot of you right now, and it's really important: the labor force and the modern skills needed for future-facing businesses. We're joined by two people with unique insights into this topic who I imagine are pretty in demand right now. Maria Flynn and Andy Van Clunen, thanks for being with us. Maria spent her entire career fighting to get justice for the American worker, first at the U.S. Department of Labor, and now as CEO of the Boston-based nonprofit Jobs for the Future, or JFF. She helps underserved populations in particular improve their employment prospects through education and training so that everyone can advance economically, regardless of the zip code in which they were born. And Andy Van Clunen is the CEO of National Skills Coalition, which he founded in 2000. He's a trusted nonpartisan resource to state governors, members of Congress, White House officials, and state and federal agencies. He helps with policies that they develop and implement for workforce solutions so that people can expand economic opportunity for every worker, every business, and every industry. Thank you both for being with us.
Great to be here.
Good to be here, Tyler.
Thanks. Maria, we'll start with you. When we look back at the last 18 months, this has been a really hard road for frontline workers across all sectors. What needs to happen to not only help these people recover what they might have lost, but come back to a better situation?
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. It's true. This has been an incredibly hard period for millions of workers. And so I believe that core to driving an equitable economic recovery is really centering the assets, the aspirations, and the needs of workers. And, for many years now, there's been, a lot of discussion across the country about the future of work, and a lot of that has been a very kind of theoretical conversation at times. And so at JFF, we really think the conversation should be helping workers think about, what's the future of me? And really the importance of this idea of find, finance, and flourish. How do you help a worker find their best career path? How do you help them finance that journey? And how do you help them flourish throughout their career? And I think that both the public and the private sector have really critical roles to play in this work. Key among them is investment. So it's important for federal, state, local government to invest in workforce development programs. It's also critically important for the private sector to be investing in their workers, particularly their frontline workers, which often kind of get left behind in investment strategies. So, I really think of this as the need for a dual transformation approach where we both invest and improve like our core kind of legacy systems and providers in the country, but also really actively look at what's around the corner and what's ahead and what is that kind of innovation that we can be harnessing. And the system that Andy and I have spent our careers working on, the workforce system, is also a system that was really built for a different era. And so I think now is the time for both the public and the private sector to be really asking those like hard fundamental questions of what is the system that we want for the workers of today and the future.
Yeah, you really beat me to referencing that line. I think it was such a really great one, and it's not theoretical anymore, is it? It's real, and it's been really thrust into the forefront in the last year and a half or so. Andy, you've committed a lot of time and energy into the idea of investing in people. It's a big theme, whether you're supporting the American Jobs Plan in front of Congress or just every day on your Twitter account that we see. But how do you invest in the American workforce, when 4.3 million workers voluntarily left their jobs in August, according to the latest Department of Labor numbers?
Yeah, Tyler, that's a great question. I think there's really two different parts to that question, right? So one is when you have a labor market where so many folks are currently on the sidelines, right? So it's not just the folks who quit their jobs recently, but we have over 4 million folks who've left the workforce permanently, or at least for the long term. They're not even considered to be in the labor market anymore. And so we have millions of folks sitting on the sideline, and we're trying to figure out like, how is it that we can get them back into an economy that has changed pretty dramatically even over the past 18 months. But then I think there's a second investment question. I think it goes to some of the things that Maria was mentioning, which is if you're an individual company and you know that people are quitting their jobs at a pretty regular pace, like what's the incentive for you to be investing in training your folks with this outside chance that they might be leaving your company within a few months after you make that investment? So I think there's two different parts to that. On the sidelines question, look, the folks who are most impacted by this pandemic were disproportionately women, workers of color, lower wage workers, folks without a BA or in many cases, even a GED. We're going to need some kind of significant public workforce investment strategy to kind of help them get back into the workforce. There's a lot of other things they're going to need besides skills too. I mean, the fact that women are so disproportionately impacted by this pandemic has a lot to do with childcare. It has to do with the on and off aspects of schooling right now. Thank goodness for the child vaccine that we think is going to be approved, because I think that's going to be a game changer in terms of making it easier for many of those caregivers to now think about actually getting back into the workforce without their schools opening and closing on a regular basis. But we have a lot of folks who are going to be looking for new jobs and new careers in a completely different industry than the one in which they were working. Think of all those retail and hospitality and restaurant workers whose employers or businesses have shut down, and that industry is downsizing. There's no question about it. And there are other industries like those in logistics that are desperate for people. But how is it that we're going to help folks make that particular shift? And I think, as Maria said, the strategies that we used in the past need to take this new context into account. So, for instance, JFF has done a tremendous amount of work on things like apprenticeship. How is it that we pay people essentially to come onto the job and train, even when we know they're not fully qualified, but we're kind of saying we're going to invest in you over time, train here on the job itself. There's a lot of folks that want to enter into an apprenticeship, but are not ready to do that. And so let's think of all of those mothers who it's not just an issue about whether or not they can show up to the job, but how are they going to have that childcare problem solved? All those folks who've never taken any kind of post-secondary training, who might need to raise some of their digital or foundational skills before they could walk onto that job site. And so this idea of pre-apprenticeship, which is something that we've kind of talked about, but really needs to be scaled up significantly if we're going to make apprenticeships available to the greatest diversity of folks necessary. And then the thing that I hear from employers all the time is we don't just want folks to be ready the day they walk onto a job site, but we want to make sure that they're stable and the parts of their lives that are currently disrupted can be stabilized as well. And transportation and childcare and support services like that, that's not typically something that an employer is going to take responsibility for. But having partnerships with other folks in the community who can help those workers succeed and stay on the job, that's a win-win for the person who's been hired, it's a win for the company as well. And I'll just say real briefly on the other issue about, so then why would a company invest their own resources? This is where I think we just need to fundamentally change how it is that we engage the business community on workforce investment. We need to stop working with individual firms, and we need to start working with industries, groups of companies who are willing to kind of come together so that collectively we're sharing the costs of how it is that we're going to build a pipeline of new workers that we want to bring into this industry, and then give those folks a chance to advance, whether it's advancing with my company or it's advancing with your company, because I know that there's a pool of workers that we all collectively have developed together with our local colleges and high schools and labor unions and others to make sure that this industry is going to be able to not suffer the kind of labor shortages that they're currently suffering in this current context.
Yeah, and you brought something up, Andy, as well that I want to put a pin in and come back to Maria on later, and that is, apprenticeships. But before we get there, I wanted to ask, and point out, look, we know different industries have their own labor challenges, but e-commerce in particular is one that really stands out. There's at least 5 times the number of workers are needed in e-commerce than for brick and mortar businesses. And we know that robotics and automation alone won't solve this challenge. So to people in the logistics industry listening to this today, what can we do to encourage more people to find a career in logistics? Maybe Maria, if you want to take that one.
Sure. So I think now more than ever, we're at a moment where workers are really in the driver's seat, right? Like workers are demanding more from their employers. They are, making decisions about how they want to kind of earn their living and spend their time in ways that we didn't necessarily see pre-pandemic. And I think, particularly in the logistics sector, I think we need to think about how to create a narrative around these jobs and around the career paths that are available in new ways. Like I read an article in the Boston Globe just 2 days ago that listed logistics jobs as one of the 7 jobs that had most declined in popularity since the beginning of the pandemic, right? So I think it's putting more pressure and more of an imperative on employers, on the companies, to really show how this can be a very solid career path that can lead to economic advancement for workers. And in the beginning, I thought it was really great how Carol, the CEO of UPS, was talking about how that's really how they think about, kind of jobs at UPS, is they see it kind of as an entry point to a broader career. And so I think that's a great model that can be followed. And then just the work that Prologis has been doing around the community workforce initiative, I think is another great, very tangible example of how corporations can be playing a role in local communities with workers and building those diverse talent pipelines that we really need to fill the jobs that are in demand.
Yeah, Andy, any thoughts on logistics in particular and the jobs needed?
Well, I certainly think that this issue about automation, Maria mentioned the future work conversation, and it's hard to think about it now. But 4 years ago, like the conversation was automation, AI, digitalization. It was basically going to take away all the jobs. Robots were coming for our jobs, and so folks thought we were going to have like a workless future. Okay, now clearly that's not happening. I think that more what we've come to understand and the acceleration of this trend over the past year and a half has kind of demonstrated is like we're creating jobs at the same time that we are eliminating jobs, but at a much higher scale, we're changing jobs. 60% of the jobs are going to have some significant change where somebody is going to have to be retrained to now work alongside technology. It's not going to be replacing them, but if they don't have the digital skills in order to be able to be part of that technology's deployment, they eventually are just not going to have a role in that company. I think for logistics, that's going to be a particularly big lift. And this is a structural issue. Like this is something, we're not just talking about small percentages of the workforce. Like we've done analyses, whether you look in healthcare or manufacturing or transportation or retail and hospitality, and you've got anywhere from 30 to 50% of the current workforce. These are skilled folks who've been working in these industries for years who do not have adequate levels of digital skills to be able to retrain for a higher paying, higher skilled job within that industry. And that means that those folks are at threat of being left behind unless industry and government kind of take that at scale and try to figure out how to raise the digital skills of all the folks in our workforce, because that's what's going to keep them on the job, as well as building the new pipeline of folks that we need to bring into some of those new jobs.
Yeah, and this is a topic that came up earlier in the conversation too. But there's so many jobs, and culture, though, as a workplace culture is something that really was challenged during the last 18 months or so. And it's one thing if you're just looking for a job and it comes down to pay and benefits and perks, but it's another where there's workplace culture that actually binds you to a place and lets you see a career in it, and maybe it's a calling, maybe it's a passion, something you do. What do you think the role of workplace culture is, now as we come out of shutdowns and lockdowns and for some remote work? Maria, you want to take that one first?
Sure. I think that the issue of culture is just more important than ever. Like just in the kind of backstage, Andy and I were talking about, what it's like to run organizations in this kind of virtual environment and recruiting and retaining employees. And that's true, I think across size of employer, across sector, being a diverse, inclusive, and equitable employer is, it's a non-negotiable. And so putting kind of those corporate statements into action is critical, and how to kind of foster belonging and meaning in the workplace is going to be like just increasingly important as we move forward. JFF, a couple months ago, we released our Recover Stronger playbook, which includes examples of specific things that corporations have done kind of in order to put the workers at the center of their recovery efforts. So I encourage folks to check that out for some specific examples. But in order to be a competitive employer and to have that competitive advantage in today's market, culture and DEI efforts and belonging is going to be critical.
Yeah, belonging is a really good way to put it. Andy, anything to add there on the culture point?
I would just echo most everything that Maria just said. I think just to reiterate the point also is that when somebody wants to come, when you ask folks kind of like what do you consider to be a quality job or a quality employer, and we're having conversations here in Washington, even the Commerce Department has now started to convene folks. They want to be able to give some advice to members of the business community about like what are the kinds of principles that you should incorporate. And I think the ones that Maria just shared would be really valuable as part of that conversation. But once you get past compensation, typically what a lot of folks kind of see across a range of different perspectives is, I want a career, right? I'm not just looking for a job. I'm looking for some opportunities for advancement. I want an employer who's willing to invest in me. And sometimes that investment in that worker means that person is going to be able to advance within your company. But sometimes it might be like, I'm in a smaller organization, like I'm investing in people all the time, but they may have to go as with many smaller employers, may have to find their next job in another place within my industry, right? And I think that us working together collectively, seeing that's a good thing. It's a good thing for the worker, and it's a good thing for the industry that folks feel that all the firms that are working together here within this industry, they all want to see people kind of entering and moving up, whether that's at one company or another. And we just then need to figure out how to share some of those costs. That's going to be better for the industry overall.
Great. I want to shift also to some more even longer term future considerations. And Maria, I know JFF has had such a long history and track record of impact, and along the way, you have innovated at every step. And a big part of what you're doing now is JFF Labs, which includes a venture investment arm. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that work and what it means.
Sure. So it kind of comes back to what I mentioned before about this idea of dual transformation. And in this sense, the core of JFF, which was originally founded back in 1983, where we were working with governors like Bill Clinton back then as governor of Arkansas, to really help to think about how do we get workers the skills they need for the jobs for the future, right? So that was a conversation that was happening at JFF back in the 1980s. And since then, we have really the core of our work is around helping to transform the core education and workforce systems in this country by working with community colleges and workforce boards and community-based organizations. But a few years ago, we really came to realize that that work is going to remain critically important. But in order to drive true impact, we needed to start directly engaging with some of the new entrants or kind of the innovators who are coming on the scene. So meaning, tech-driven solutions and the entrepreneurs and the investors that were involved in these companies. And so we launched JFF Labs in early 2018. About a year later, we brought in the Employment Technology Fund, which we now refer to as ETF at JFF Labs, because we felt that we wanted to also be able to pull on this lever of directly investing in startups, early stage startups, that are really mission aligned with JFF, that are putting workers at the center, that have a strong equity focus, and that are bringing scalable solutions to the market. Because I think that's one thing that the public systems have struggled with over decades is how do you take effective strategies to scale quickly? And I think technology obviously is going to be a key piece of that. So we have about a $20 million fund. We have about 23 companies in our portfolio right now. Ranging from innovative finance companies to assessment companies to platforms where you can access internships and high quality work-based learning opportunities. But aside from the fund, we also really work to bring some signal to the noise in the market. And so we produce market scans on things like career navigation technology, pre-hire assessment tools. We also did one on virtual reality and augmented reality tools. And then we helped to bring kind of the innovators to watch, so to speak, in partnership with the community-based organizations, the employers, and others that we are working with. And so, for example, right before the shutdown in 2020, we had a event where our corporate partners could come and really get demos and kind of hands-on experience with some of the leading VR companies that we showcase in our market scan. So having this very practical application between what are the trends in the market and how can it help drive equitable impact through these traditional systems.
That's great. On the subject of technology, I know to both of you, advanced automation, and we talked about this, touched on it a moment earlier, where whether it's AI or advanced automation, it's really changing the way that people work. It isn't. You're right. I think Andy said earlier, the robots aren't coming for us anymore. I think that's come up every time some new technology is swept through industry as a whole, and we've seen it happen. But it does mean that the nature of work is changing. What does it mean for workers when automation and AI are coming into the mix, and what does it mean for companies? Andy.
Well, I think for one, how that technology is introduced is really key, right? And I think if you want employees, if you want workers to feel like the technology is something that's enhancing the competitiveness and the viability of this company, and it's not there to replace them, then you need to make them part of how it is that it's being introduced, not just how it is that you're training them, but they may have some ideas about its introduction in a way that actually is going to make their jobs more effective, make their work better, in addition to making the company more profitable. And I do think that that's where mistakes that were probably made, back in manufacturing. Now, this automation in manufacturing goes back decades, right? And I think what both the business community and the labor community learned is that when they worked together on introducing automation in manufacturing, it made U.S. manufacturing more competitive. It made manufacturing jobs safer for U.S. manufacturers and for manufacturing workers. And overall, it kept those jobs. It did not eliminate jobs. It kept jobs that otherwise would have gone overseas or would have gone to other competitor nations. So I do think how it's introduced is just as important as its deployment. And I think involving working folks and thinking about how to do that in a way that is making their working life better. We're not asking them to kind of work alongside the machines. We don't want to increase their stress of their job because of how it is the technology is being used. It should be enhancing their work as well as enhancing the firm's profitability.
Well, that's a tough one, right? Because is it just a messaging challenge? Is it because this is often an emotional reaction that folks have to something like this coming into play versus the rational argument of history, and this has happened before. I don't know. Do either one of you kind of have some thoughts about how to compete with that sort of immediate emotional reaction to thinking that machines are kind of coming for or making your job more difficult?
I think transparency is obviously key. I think having clear guidance on reskilling opportunities, on kind of what career advancement might look like. And so I think it's helping leadership, I think, has a critical role to play in helping workers kind of see the future and how they fit into that future. And I think that can be done well. It can also be done poorly, but I think that transparency and leadership and messaging and not just looking at the changes today, but what that means for 12, 18 months down the road is really critical. I'd also add, I think AI also has a critical role to play around helping to move towards more skill-based hiring and helping to really kind of automate and innovate on kind of the front end of the employee experience. And so I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity for kind of piloting and innovation as well. So not just in terms of the actual work being done, but on kind of the HR side of the company and how to enhance some of those practices.
I wonder if either of you think too that could be something that could come out of the higher education system. I know the current higher education system, folks are concerned about its structure, its ability to meet the needs of students and companies together. And I know you're both passionate about this, but students are often leaving higher education with a high amount of debt and maybe not even all the skills that they need to do these sort of jobs of the future, marketable skills. So what do you think the future of higher education looks like, and how would it play into this equation?
Absolutely. We need to make higher ed work. We need to make college work for working people and for local businesses. And Maria's absolutely right. As industry has kind of started to look at skills-based hiring as a way to, not just using the bachelor's degree as kind of like the marker about whether or not they think somebody's going to work out or not in their job at a company, but kind of really like, what is it you actually need to be able to do this job well? I think that's a really important move that industry has made. Unfortunately, higher education policy does not reward skills-based training in our higher education system. I mean, we spend between the private sector and the public sector over $1 trillion a year in some form of post-secondary education and training. About 2/3 of that is in formal college and university settings. But we basically reimburse those programs for 4-credit programs, at least half-time, more often full-time students. And if you had a particular set of skills that you needed to develop, either to get a job or to advance within your job, a shorter-term program, something that was going to take less than 16 weeks or 600 hours sitting in a classroom desk, you cannot get federal tuition aid for that. And in most states, you can't get that either. So that's why things like reforming the Pell Grant so that short-term programs that you have a group of firms within an industry who said, if somebody gets these skills, we're going to promote them or hire them. So we know there's a good chance of outcomes and success. It's just a matter of changing how we think about investing in higher education. It means the institutions need to change to catch up to where workers in industry are. And I think that's one of a number of different things. It's unfortunate, obviously, folks have been watching what's happening here in Washington with Build Back Better package and what Washington is going to pass and put to the president's desk. I think everyone's probably heard that free community college is not going to be part of that final package. But I will say that even when the negotiations were happening about how to bring down the cost of the free community college proposal, the first thing they went to cut was the workforce programs, right? And in a situation where you have millions of folks who are looking to get back into the labor market, that's the first place we should be putting some of our investments. So I'm hoping that we will continue to have some conversations here in Washington and state capitals around the country about changing our higher education systems, including investing in industry-tested programs, building partnerships between colleges and local industry, because I think ultimately that's going to be the best thing for those local communities, for workers and industry, if we're willing to change some of the institutional ways that we support those higher ed systems.
Yeah, I think that probably rings true to a lot of folks. And speaking of a lot of folks, I think Tracy probably has some questions from some of the folks in the audience.
You know, I did, but in the interest of time, we might have, and a lot of the questions that came through really related to technology, robotics, and the interplay of those two. And I think you've done a stellar job with the panelists today on that topic.
That's the two of them are always thinking around corners, and now they've thought around the corners of the questions that anticipated them. So maybe we'll just quickly wrap and I think ask you both to think optimistically about the next 5 years. What are you excited about in terms of changes that you see coming in the next 5 years, and where do you think you can help have the most impact around those changes? You want to start, Maria?
Of course, I'm excited about a lot. I think we really have a unique window here in the next 5 years to drive a great deal of impact. Excited about, just how to step back and have this broader conversation around what is the public system that we want to see for workforce moving forward, and what is the right role of the public sector versus the private sector in that. I think we have a moment in time to really have a deep conversation on that. And then I would also say continuing to really be the bridge around these pieces of dual transformation, really helping to bridge the traditional systems that are driving their own transformation and bridging them to some of the tech-driven solutions and innovations that are coming on the market.
Great. And anything you're optimistic about in the next 5 years?
Yeah, listen, this has been a really hard 18 months, but I think the one thing we can take from it is this proved to us things that I think a lot of us knew intellectually, which is like to where Maria started. We have a lot of 20th century systems that need to be catching up to a 21st century economy, right? Our workforce systems, our unemployment systems, our retraining systems, how it is that we support small businesses so they can retain their workers instead of having to lay them off during a downturn. They were stress tested and they failed. So I take some real optimism from the fact that folks have kind of come to that realization and realize that we need to do some wholesale changing about how we think about investing in workers, not just to get them into a job, but how we can keep them on a job, how we can keep them with their current employer, how we can keep them with their current industry. The future of work turned out to be right now. It wasn't like robots came and took everybody's job, but I don't think anybody anticipated how quickly the change was going to happen. We basically compressed 10 years worth of projected change into the space of about 10 months. So I think that that's a wake-up call that all of us now recognize that we need to start working together and accelerating what we are doing to put the kinds of changes into place that are going to keep workers and businesses ahead of the technological curve moving into the future.
Great. Well, Andy and Maria, I can't think of two people whose opinions are needed more right now and in the forefront of people's minds. Thank you for your time with us. We really appreciate it. And back to you, Tracy.